David, it's good to see you again, my friend. I'm so glad to be speaking with you again about pleasure.
Yeah, love talking with you, and it's been a while, so I'm ready to
Yes.
jump in and see where we go.
Well, let's pick up where we left off in part one. We covered the first three levels of the pleasure map, and for people who are interested in those first three levels and haven't seen them yet, we'll put a link to that in our show notes, and we'll also have a link in the show notes to a much broader, longer course on the pleasure map that Dr. Mark Goffney led a few years ago. That has a much deeper dive than we'll be able to go into this short time that we have together. So I wanted to provide those resources, but I think we pick up today at level 4.
Yeah, and maybe it's just worth reiterating just a little bit,
Sure.
Tom, that like just a reminder of what we're here to do, and it's that we are really standing for pleasure as being the compass of our lives, right? The compass for how do I live my life. And so we're redefining it based on the teachings of Dr. Mark Gaffney, who's, as you said, has the whole course on this. But it's really about saying pleasure is not merely this sort of hedonistic thing that we are that the religions say to, avoid and kind of ignore, neglect. It's actually reality itself wanting to evolve through us, right? And so, we talked about making sense of pleasure and using the pleasure map as a way to help orient ourselves so we can actually use it as a compass for our lives,
Right.
right?
As a
So,
kind of a
yeah,
divine signal to us that, yeah, come this way. Come this
yeah,
way. There's pleasure way beyond your primitive notions of pleasure that can guide you into your highest calling.
yeah. And a key distinction is the pseudo pleasure versus the genuine pleasure, right? And the reason why
Right.
people get so confused and scared of pleasure is because we don't know how to make that distinction.
Right.
And so this map is here to help us to identify the different voices within ourselves that either are pushing away from or attracted to pleasure, right? So becoming aware of those, and then coming to understand, as we did in the first video, that there's principles of pleasure that if we learn, for example, that pleasure is a skill, that we have to cultivate it, that actually there's counterfeits for every level of pleasure, right? That there are these levels of pleasure that we want to be balanced in a certain way, right? So, and everyone should go back to that first video and see all the things we talk about. But when we recognize these pleasure principles at play, we can better orient ourselves. And so last time we talked about the first three levels, right? The pleasure of the sense of the five senses, right? And then the second level, pleasure of relationships. Third level, the pleasure of standing for a cause, right? And now we're moving on to the change that changes everything, as
Right.
Dr. Mark often
I,
says.
I love the way you set that up. And I do want to add to that this. In a sense, this whole pleasure map and our desire to articulate it along with Dr. Goffney and our colleagues at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion um, is is as a response in part to centuries of rejection of pleasure as a guiding principle, or the reduction of pleasure to something less than it is. And I also want to put a disclaimer here. If you're saying, "Oh, I hope they talk about the pleasure of a really good ice cream cone," that's in the first video. So go back to that. We're not going to talk about that today, but it's there. We're not ignoring that, but we're going to talk about different kinds, different levels of pleasure in this clarification of how do I live my life.
Yeah,
But David,
exactly.
what is pleasure level 4?
Level four. So this is, as Dr. Mark says, the change that changes everything. It's the pleasure of knowing who you really are, the pleasure of gnosis. And true gnosis is knowing your true nature, right? So we also call it the pleasure of true self, is actually recognizing that we are not separate from anything that is, that we are one with all that is, that beyond this skin encapsulated sense of individual ego, that we are connected to the entire field, right? And one thing um, that's really remarkable about this level of pleasure is that it transforms our relationship to the first three levels of pleasure.
Mm.
So we could, if you, we'll talk a little bit about ice cream, right? So we can have really good ice cream, and it tastes great at level one pleasure. But once we realize and we have an awakening to our true nature, and then we go back to that ice cream, it's like all of reality is experienced in that pleasure of having
Right.
that ice cream. It's like
Right.
it completely transforms our relationship to that and every
Right.
single level of pleasure.
Exactly. One story about this level of pleasure is about an enlightened master who woke up to level four pleasure as a child. He said he could hardly stop laughing during meals because he just delighted in the fact that he was eating himself, because he could no longer see the food as other than himself, which is the nature of this. The Kashmir Shaivists, at least some of them, talk about recognition. To recognize that everything I cast my eye on, everything is God's being, to use the theistic language around it. And that is no separate than the God's being that I am. Or put differently, when I experience the fundamental experience of I am, that is identical. That is the same experience as all of creation, when all of creation experiences I am.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is an all-pervasive quality. You brought in the theistic experience of it. I remember when I went to university at Xavier University, and I was studying with the Jesuits a lot, and going kind of through the theistic version of this gnosis, true self. I remember walking to class every day and literally feeling myself full of God's love, the love of the universe, and seeing everyone with the eyes of God, actually seeing that love being reflected back to me. So everyone was an expression of this one love that pervades all things. And it was just like, ecstatic, right? And just like teary eyed. It was just, I felt connected. And at any given point, I was able just to shift my awareness to be able to be present in this, this very moment, and realize that there was a perfection that I was participating in.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, as a
Yeah.
musician, I often get a lot of my wisdom teachings from musicians I admire, and Carlos Santana calls it the universal tone um, that underlies the whole thing. The universal tone is this same thing, and then you just named a Bob Marley song, "One Love," and we know. Those of us who know the Bob Marley story know that he was a deeply spiritually connected human, and he's singing about level four pleasure, the pleasure of recognizing that who I am is this universal tone, this one love.
Yeah. And there's so many ways to access it, right? And if any of us who has fallen in love, we get a glimpse of it. We get
Mhm.
a temporary, download from the cosmos of just like, oh wow, everything is beautiful and everything is shimmering with that one love, with that universal tone.
Right.
But
It can happen in
we
a
could
walk
talk.
in the woods.
Yeah, yeah, and we could talk about maybe several different ways that we can access it, but maybe before doing that, the price. So every level of pleasure actually has a price, meaning we have to give up something in order to receive it.
Right.
And the price of this level of pleasure, is dying to your separate self. So actually
Right.
being willing to give up the hegemony, the all-encompassing the priority of my separate self as being the driver of this car, and actually letting go to something beyond it, right?
Right. Right. The
Yeah,
Sufis called it dying before you die.
yeah,
That's the death. Or when we've experienced it, let's say in sexual ecstasy, it's called the orgasm in French is called the little death. I don't speak French, but I've heard it said that the French call the orgasmic experience the little death. And I think that is a finger pointing at the truth that in that moment, we lose our separate identity and surrender to something much grander than ourselves, which is this one love that we are realizing at pleasure level four.
yeah. And even as you talk about it, it's sort of a pointing out instruction, right? And it kind of orients my being toward it. And I know that you've practiced meditation a lot over the years, right? And I have as well. maybe just taking a minute or two to share like some of the other practices or something about your practice in meditation.
Yeah. What my practice has come to, lately, and this is just personal to me, and it's just now. I mean, I have meditated for 50 years, and so my practice today is different than it was even 3 weeks ago. But these days, my practice is very much Kashmir Shaivist informed, where I begin with the body, and I'm aware of my body. I'm aware of the sounds and smells that I'm experiencing, all as one big field. I'm aware, I'm aware, I'm aware. I'm aware of the roles and identities that I've taken on over the years. And so I keep on backing up away from the actual being of these things and just observing them, being aware, aware, and aware. And then I ground myself in I am awareness. If I were, obviously I'm doing this non-verbally, but if I were to verbalize, it would be I am awareness. And then the word or the notion of awareness falls away, and I'm left with I am. Rupert Spira, a wonderful teacher from England, says that the only completely true and unconditioned sentence that we can utter is I am. Everything else is partial and conditioned. So I end up spending most of my hour each morning meditating, resting in I am. And the pleasure associated with landing in and resting in pure being is what we're talking about at level 4.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much spaciousness, right? And it's where we can simply observe without holding on to the contractions of the separate self, and over time, oftentimes the separate self, the feeling of contraction, sort of just soften and loosen up, and we actually, um, experience a greater sense of self,
Right.
right? This awareness, as you speak of.
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
any
You
of
know,
us,
Christopher
yeah,
Wallace, Christopher Wallace, a Kashmir Shaivist scholar, has a phrase for it: pre-discursive awareness. Awareness before I start attaching labels to what I'm aware of.
mm,
Pre-discursive awareness. It's a little intellectualized for my taste, which is why my path is really just through backing up away from the content of my experience, observing it, and then backing away, and then landing in pure awareness, and then from there to I am.
yeah. One of the practices I've been doing more lately, which is breath work.
Mhm.
And I hadn't done it historically very much. I've always been, I've been trained in transcendental meditation, which is basically doing what you're describing. But I found that a lot of times, and not to get into the weeds here, but a lot of times there is a remaining stuckness in the body,
Mhm.
bioenergetic stuckness, right? And you're trained as a core energetics specialist, so you get this, right? Like there's still things that it's awareness. You can be aware of the contractions, and the contractions are still there, and yet you're in the awareness, the observer, right? But the breath work I found is able to kind of open up the bioenergetic space too.
Oh,
Um,
beautiful. Yeah, and I just want to add that I don't just do this I am awareness. I mean, I also do energetic work. I get the bat out and club the bed. I mean, I have a whole thing because, as you say, a lot of these obstacles to resting in awareness are just lodged in our bodies through a history of small t and, in many cases, large T traumas. And that energy has to be moved for us to have free flowing access to that
yeah,
resting in beingness.
yeah. Which also leads me to the counterfeit we didn't mention yet. The
Beautiful.
counterfeit to level 4 is bypassing this bypassing your own humanness, right?
Hmm.
Is if so we can, in other words, a counterfeit means that we use the level 4 realization and in a way that's not complete, not whole, and we actually use it to repress, bypass, neglect everything that's being observed, right? In a certain sense, and
Right.
we cut off parts of ourself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. We can, if we get lost, um, ignore the fact that we're actually walking around this planet in a body. And we can also, there's also a kind of if the ego gets a foothold here, it can also turn to nihilism. Nothing matters. If I am simply all is one, and it doesn't matter if Hitler's part of God's being, and as much a part of God's being as Mother Teresa is part of God's being, then what I do doesn't matter, and nothing matters. And so, if the ego steps in and hijacks at this level, this resting in being or resting in awareness, or the gnosis of the pleasure of the gnosis of the way things actually are, no separation, no boundary. The nihilistic dimensions of the ego can step in and say, well, nothing matters then. We can do whatever we want, and who cares?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so as we observe in our true self practice, as we observe what's arising moment to moment, we want to be attentive to the arising of a desire for a better world and a need to be taking care of myself as an individual, human embodied person, right? And actually being attentive to those very real, albeit temporary phenomenon of being a human and kind of the things that we observe as we are resting in awareness
Yeah,
to be able to act on those things,
yeah,
which leads us to the next level whenever you're ready
yes.
to jump to that.
Yeah, I mean, have we covered everything in level four? I mean, is there some dimension of the qualities of level four that we haven't covered? Because I'm also feeling the pull to level five, because level five is a direct response to the nihilist. So
Yeah,
that's why
exactly.
I feel
Right.
like we're poised to get there, but I don't want to rush it. So check
Right.
us on this, David.
Yeah, well, I think that one important thing is to remember that there's so many ways to access it, right?
Mhm.
And there are, in a sense, there are first person methodologies like meditation, but there's also chanting, there's music, there's ecstatic dance, right? There's second person
Mhm.
methodologies like prayer and like surrendering to the divine,
And the
like
writings
actually
of the
part.
Christian mystics of Renaissance and pre-Renaissance, the Middle Ages, like Brother Lawrence. If I want to really get a deep sense of what, and other traditions as well, but lately I've been steeped in some medieval Christian mystics who are definitely exploring this kind of notion of gnosis, or for the nature of reality, but through a distinctly dualistic. I think the Christians have fleshed it out because sometimes the first person approach in Christianity has been called blasphemous, and you can get killed if you articulate the first person version in medieval Christianity. A lot of people were. Friar Bruno was in 1500. He started articulating these first person realizations of level four beingness, and they burned him at the stake. We're not going to have any of that. So you have to kind of poke around for the more acceptable in certain traditions, second person devotional realizations, and they're just as valid.
Yeah, yeah,
Prayer
and
is
that
simply
was.
another way of doing this.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're in devotion to the ultimate, that whatever name you ascribe to that, the beloved, the mystery, God, however you decide it, actually it does dissolve the sense of I'm the only one in control. This is my egoic life. It actually dissolves that experience and surrenders to a larger, second person
Right.
reality. And there's also a third person methodologies,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe this is the lesser of the understood methodologies, but deep study, scholarly study, is a path to this realization too. Deep study of nature, the laws of nature, and the intelligence that's alive in nature, the study of complexity theory and the way that the universe is all one and interconnected, right? And mysteriously, yeah, the field of reality is seamless but not featureless, which again gets us to the next level.
Yeah. One last word on the third person uh, pathway is, and this may come from being the little brother of a nuclear physicist. I am constantly drawn to videos of physicists talking about the nature of reality, and I I don't have the math skills, training, or talent to understand it the way a physicist does. So I, I attend to quantum physics and other dimensions of the material sciences, really more as poetry or metaphor to help me to just be in awe. Be in awe. I remember in 2019 at the festival we both attended in southern Holland, that there was a video that Mark showed, and we can put that in link in the show notes if we remember, of a computer simulation of the coming into existence and popping out of existence of the Planck field, of pure possibility, little flecks of reality, and subatomic particles hopping from one peak to another. You remember that video? I mean, it was just breathtaking.
And vaguely, I'm curious to go
Yeah,
back to it.
that stuff. I don't understand it the way a physicist or other good scientist would understand it. But to me, it speaks to the same thing, the same reality. It's not separate. It's one reality.
Yeah,
All right, we've waited
just
long
coming at
enough.
it from third person. Yeah,
Exactly.
right.
We've waited long
Yeah,
enough. Level
yeah.
5. What is it, David?
Level 5. So this is level 5 of pleasure. And by the way, as a reminder, every next level is so powerful, so pleasurable that we are oftentimes willing to give up the previous level in order to get the next level.
Mm.
Right? So something so powerful. What possibly could be more pleasurable than realizing your true nature? Like, oh my God. Well, something more pleasurable is knowing that I am a unique expression of that reality. And so we call it, Dr. Mark calls it the power, the pleasure of creativity, of living your unique self,
Right.
which means a unique expression of the creative force that animates all that is. That is that one love that we talk about. So,
Exactly. And I love the clarification of that teaching that has emerged over the years since I first heard it articulated quite a number of years ago. In the early years, it was just the realization that I am a unique expression of this all that is, this divine allness, or God. But to add that almost a vehicle, my unique self is a vehicle for the creative expression of God, of Shiva. The Kashmir Shaivists, I keep coming back to them because they're big in my life, as they are, and frankly, a lot of us in the center. Um, the the Kashmir Shaivists speak of this as the creative impulse of Shiva dancing. But we dance through our uniqueness. We dance through our uniqueness. And, it's one thing to know that I am Shiva, say the Shaivists. It's a whole nother thing to understand that they don't have this quite articulated this way, but you can kind of feel the precursors to this but how does Shiva manifest? And Shiva manifests in this reality through us. God manifests in this reality through us as a pure act of creativity. You can see this in the Recognition Sutra, a 1,000-year-old Kashmir Shaivist text. The divine, which in that text is translated as the goddess awareness, is infinitely creative and manifests the universe out of her unlimited creative impulse, her infinite creative impulse. And so this kind of limited puddle of consciousness named Ronen is simply a creative expression of the divine. And when I realize that, the world changes. How about for you?
yeah, totally. Right. So when we realize that it's not just, oh, because a lot of times, especially in a lot of spiritual circles, kind of like, kind of alternative spirituality circles, they say, even the traditional circles, right? They say, let go of your story. And that's when you're going to find, peace.
Mhm.
Or the Course in Miracles talks about, I'm forgetting the quote all of a sudden, but basically give up yourself, and that's when you'll really find true peace. And that is still the price that we have to pay at this level to discover our unique self. We have to continually die to our separate selves, but but there's a clarification that happens, right? And we distinguish between my individual story from the perspective of the separate self and the individual story from the perspective of unique self. Because, as you're saying, each of us is a unique expression of that love intelligence and love beauty and love desire that is the initiating and animating energy and eros of all that is, that lives in us, as us, and through us, that never was, is, or will be ever again expressed other than through you and me as our unique selves. And as such, we have a unique quality of being. We have a unique quality of intimacy. We have a unique set of gifts that are uniquely ours to give that no one else can give other than us. Right? So when we actually step into that, we realize, wait a minute, I have such a pool of possibility that wants to emerge uniquely through me, through my unique configuration of desire, my unique configuration of, we call it lines and circles, masculine and feminine qualities, right? The unique gifts that are sort of in latent within us. And so, a practice for doing this, there's so many practices like in the unique self emergence process that Claire Molinard and I are doing. And in your process, I'm sure you've got various versions of this because most of them come from Dr. Mark Gaffney.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually so there's one practice, we call it detours and destinations, where
Mm-hmm.
we look back into our story when we've somehow felt like we've made a mistake, we've failed, we went off the path, we've just taken the wrong turn somewhere, and feel like the remorse, the guilt, the shame, whatever it is, right? And that's our ego story. That's our separate self story. But when we go back to that story, and now this time from the perspective of what if this is actually my unique self story? What if everything that happened during that time in my life was meant to enable my unique self expression to emerge more fully? And what would it be like? How could I reinterpret it as a unique self? Because it's in reality, if level 4 pleasure is accurate, which is that everything is God, all is God, there's no separation. That means every unique expression, every unique self on our own unique journeys, everywhere we go is God. So every mistake we've made is actually meant to happen. Every detour is a destination, right? Everywhere we fall into the hands of the beloved who's holding us and walking with us, right? So this
What a reference! I
clarification of
mean,
our story.
a dozen years ago, Mark and I wrote an article that people can still find online called "Every Detour is the Destination," or something like that, which is exactly what you just stated. There is no such thing, in fact, when all is said and done, as a detour.
Yeah.
There's nothing to forgive. There's no error to fix. Uh, uh, this is all a perfect pathway to the realization of unique self. This is who I have come to be, and it's a dimension of the creativity. It's an expression of the creative impulse of the divine.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
exactly.
So how do we
Yeah.
do that? So we got practices. That's a practice. What other practices that you and Claire have brought forward in your work?
Yeah. Well, there's one practice called Confessions of Greatness,
Mm-hmm.
where we go back again into our story and look for times when we felt ourselves in the fullest aliveness
Mm-hmm.
of our being, doing something that was ours to do. So oftentimes this happens in my life when I'm coaching clients or when I'm facilitating a group of people to grow and to evolve together. And I just show up and there's something else that moves me, right? It actually, I'm not doing it alone. So it's not that I get out of the way, as some people like to say. It's my ego stops being the front of things and it cedes to my unique self. So my unique self comes to the fore and allows the whole universe to move through me and sort of um, live through me and love
Mm-hmm.
through me. So that's one, Confessions of Greatness.
Yeah, I've often
Yeah.
heard in retreat space people saying, "I'm so sick of my story, I want to give it up," which I think is part of the allure of those teachers who I think err, as you pointed out earlier, a couple of moments ago. err by saying, give up your story altogether. And they seem to mean the whole story. And what people are sick of in these retreat spaces when they say that is they're sick of the separate self, ego base, often, usually, in fact, trauma created sense of separation from all that is and from each other. We desperately want to give up that story. But there's a much greater story, the greatest story ever told, you could call it, the story of my unique self emerging
Yeah.
and my realization that, in fact, I am that expression of the creative impulse of of the beingness that we realize the pleasure of in level 4.
Yeah. Yeah, and the ego hijacking is a counterfeit, right? And so it's understandable that people are they try to avoid the ego altogether. They say ego, it just causes so much trouble. I'm sure there's a good Yiddish word for that, to be like, oh, gefelt or whatever, however you say it. It's like, oh my God, I don't want to deal with that anymore. But that's what the power of the unique self teaching actually brings, is that we can start to distinguish between what is my ego response and what is my unique self response. So for quick example, the ego reacts to situations, and the unique self responds from a more grounded, centered place. If we're just having unconscious reactivity and doing things, we're oftentimes led by an old pattern, maybe a wound from childhood, maybe just our typology that's just playing itself out over and over again unconsciously. But when we're able to actually sit and rest in the moment, and from the stillness and silence of that moment, respond with power and energy and love in service to something that's beyond ourselves, then it's a clear sign that the unique self is at play. And the great thing is that the universe gives us very quick litmus test, and it feels great. And the feeling continues, and there's like a really good aftertaste when we're in
Mm-hmm.
that, right?
Right. Which is why the moments of greatness practice that you described is so powerful. Because these moments of greatness, we feel about as good as we've ever felt in our lives. I had one yesterday with a new client I worked with, and it was like, oh, right, this is what I'm supposed to be doing all the time, and I love the way you say, I don't get out of the way, but I don't drive it. I, I somehow surf the energetic force that feels sacred to me, that is arising in me, through me, in full appreciation of my unique gifts, path, everything that these nearly 70 years have taught me to give to this one client, unleashed by any um, wounding from 50 years ago or 70 years ago, or any false humility that who am I to do this? It's empowered by what Dr. Goffney calls holy audacity. This is mine to do. And as the Blues Brothers might say, which was an audacious thing for them to say, we're on a mission from God. And again, which of course points to the hijacking.
Right. Because
Right. If
that's
the
so
ego
important.
wants to be
Yeah.
that, right?
Right. Yeah, the unique self would add, I'm on a mission from God, and so are you. And so are you. Everyone is, right? And
Right.
like that's the distinction, right? It's when the
Right.
ego is hijacking, it's like I'm on a mission from God and you're not. I'm better than you, whatever.
Right.
This is mine to do, and you're nothing, you're
And
nobody,
well,
right?
worse than that, your mission from God, what your so-called mission from God is blasphemy.
Yeah, right, exactly, right? Yeah,
I, I,
exactly.
I found a Facebook group that actually I saw your name on it, and that drew me in. It's like Mystical Christians or something like that, Mystical
Mm-hmm.
Christianity. And I said, well, I dip my toe in that. My buddy David's in that. I dip my toe in. And the very first post I see is some guy just ranting about, the one way to interpret this dimension of Christ's life. And it was like, holy moly, this is
Yeah,
not like the circle of mystics I was expecting to find here. This guy
right.
is clearly saying, I'm on a mission from God, and you people are blasphemers. So,
Yeah. Well, and that points to like the another quality of unique self when you know you're able to be a unique self is that we can hold paradox. and we can recognize it. We have a more of a both and mentality. We can see the spark of the sacred in everything. And so it's less about, the ego wants to be right, and the unique self gives up being right
Right.
and recognizes there's spark in everything. Now, it doesn't mean that everything's equally okay, right? We can stand for something as unique self, but it's like,
Value exists, right?
right, that value is existing, and and there's more value in living your unique self than there is in just living as an ego. And
Right.
that's, for example, it's a very simple one, right?
Yeah.
And I want to work for a world where there's more unique selves that are showing up, and less
Yeah.
ego. Uh, yeah, because that's how we show up in a symphony, and we synergize with people, and we join genius, and create things that we could not otherwise create on our own, when we
And we
realize that
allow
we are
ourselves to be
part.
in awe of the unique self-expression of other unique selves. We look at
Yeah,
another fully expressed unique self and be in as awe of that as we are in awe of our own pleasure and our own expression of that divine impulse.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
I feel
It's
that
a
I feel
beautiful
the pull of
experience.
level 6, but before I want to check in with you again, David. What have we left out that we don't want to move on to level 6 before talking about?
Hmm. Right. So level 5, creativity of living as your unique self. Yeah,
The
I think.
skill, and we've pointed at the skill. And one thing occurs to me, not to interrupt, but one
Hmm,
thing occurs to me is we've been pointing at practices. I think ultimately all of these practices are the process of clarification. The Hebrew word that Mark uses for this is berur. So this is a very old concept, the clarification of my unique self. And it goes back to the earlier skill that we learned in one of the earlier levels of pleasure, of discernment. Clarification is really kind of an evolution of discernment, in which we learn to discern our wounded separate self imitations of unique self, and clarify not that but this. And so I would say that the skill that at this level, because as you said at the outset, pleasure is a skill that can be learned, is the ongoing process of continually clarifying what is my unique self
yeah. Yeah,
and
and
what
it's
is not.
it's right, and it's something that lasts a lifetime, right? We always are continuing to clarify, and also recognizing a quote that Dr. Mark uses a lot is mythologize, don't pathologize.
Right.
Right? It's like we it's not about fixing ourselves because we're broken, and certainly it's good to do shadow work, right, and to go to therapy when it's appropriate, and we can't reduce our journey to, oh, I just got to keep fixing myself and just keep
Right.
healing my wounds. We actually, in some ways, the unique wounding that we have is the doorway to our unique greatness. When we trace
Right.
even our greatest wounds back to the source, we actually get the source of our unique self.
Right.
And that's such an important thing to realize. Like, we're not mistakes. It brings
Right.
tears to my eyes when I'm remembering that. Like, nobody is here as a mistake. Everyone is intended. Everyone is desired and adored by reality and needed here.
Right.
That's
In my initial meeting with my new client yesterday, um, she said, "Well, this feels very different than from what I read on your website. Feels very different than therapy that I know." And I said, "Well, that's because it's not therapy. I don't even consider myself in the healing arts because I don't consider you as sick or broken. We're here. We're all here to evolve together, and I'm here just to walk with you in this evolutionary process that you and I are both in. We're not fixing broken people when we invite each other to evolve. When we're inviting a 1-year-old to let go of the coffee table and walk on her own, we're not trying to fix her. We're encouraging her. Come on, express yourself. She's not broken because she hasn't walked yet. She's perfectly fine. And it's just the next
right.
thing she's going to do happens to be to take a few steps without the coffee table to hold on to.
Right.
These are
Exactly.
not the healing arts. So I
Yeah.
now feel
And
pulled. Can you feel the pull of
okay.
level 6?
Yeah, we've been dipping our toes into it, so I think it's
We
ready to
have.
jump.
It's
Yeah.
present in me. And
Okay.
actually, before we do that, I do want to point out that this impulse that we feel to move from one level to the next has its own level of pleasure. What does Mark call it? The creative impulse that pulls us from one level to the next.
Yeah, well, he does talk about the vector of growth, which
That's
is
it.
that,
That's
right, which is the energy that keeps us moving. And you mentioned clarification, and clarification kind of taps into this, right? Part of what, when we clarify who we are, we start to realize that it's not just a static, I am the expression of the universe here and now, but there's a story that's evolving, right? And there's my personal transformation actually impacts the whole thing. I participate in an evolving field. And so level 6, if we get a drum roll here,
it.
is the power of the pleasure of the power of living as your evolutionary unique self.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a certain pleasure that comes when we realize, oh, I'm not just a unique discretion or distinct expression of the universe, but I am an evolving expression of the universe that participates in evolution itself. Right? So it's a huge story, right? We are actually participating, our personal transformations participate in the transformation of all. We ripple across the entire field every step we take. And it's
Yeah.
pleasurable.
I will say one of the great awakenings I had early in my study of this particular line of study was the realization, and there was pleasure in this that is directly related to the pleasure that we're talking about at level 6, the realization that the infinite that I encounter at level 4 is itself evolutionary, at least in this world. It is an evolutionary, at least from the perspective of this human existence. This it is an evolutionary God, an
Mm.
evolutionary reality. Which then, if I then couple that with what you just described as the evolutionary unique self, then oh my God, I am an evolutionary expression of an evolutionary reality. And to the extent I am capable in any given moment of being conscious of that process, I not only reap the pleasure benefits of that, I actually get to consciously participate in the evolution of reality. And from the theistic language perspective, I get to consciously participate in the evolution of God. And oh my
Yeah.
God, as soon as I kind of felt that in my body, it was like, I'll have
There's
more of that,
power.
please. Yeah,
Right.
that's the
There's a
power.
power. That's the
That's the power.
power. That's the power. And it seems so contradictory, right? Like, how is it possible? Wait a minute. If we wake up to this oneness, everything's perfect, and how could that perfection evolve? Right? But that's part of, once we realize unique self, we can rest in the paradox of it. Because if you think about it, one way to look at it is, if you think about it, that all is God, including our experience of reality. And our experience of reality is clearly evolving and changing and growing. And therefore, God is evolving, changing, and growing, because that's just part of everything.
Right.
Right. So, um,
How could
and
not
there's a,
how could God not be evolutionary if I, as a unique expression of the divine, or of all that is, or of reality, if you prefer the non-theistic language, how could if I am a manifestation of the creative impulse of that we realized at level 4, and I realize at level 5 that I am a manifestation of that creative impulse, and I'm evolving, then how could we not be participating in the evolution of reality when we evolve?
yeah,
And what a
exactly.
powerful stance to be in.
Right. Because it actually says, wait a minute, you mean there's more to come? There's more possibilities here. And I'm not only do I have a unique set of gifts and perspectives in my unique sphere of influence, but when I know those gifts and respond in a way that gives those gifts, it somehow participates in this larger evolution. And part of the price, again, that we have to pay in order to live as our evolutionary unique self and experience that power is we have to die to our sense of smallness. We have to allow ourselves, allow the sense that what's most important is just what's happening in my small little life, disconnected from everything else. We actually have to die to that story. We have to realize that no, there is something larger that's calling me. There actually is a calling, and a certain sense in which Dr. Marcus coined this term unique obligation, that if I have unique sets of gifts that only I can offer in my sphere of influence, and that there is a genuine need that only I can fulfill, then it's my calling to actually take those steps and to give those gifts and respond to that need. And the
Right.
pleasure is
It's the
just
evolutionary
outstanding.
impulse that creates the unique self obligation, really the mandate to step up. In a sense, I can hear in this, even though this is from a pre-modern, this is pre-modern language. This is essentially the Bodhisattva vow. The Bodhisattva in Buddhist philosophy understands that his own personal enlightenment is insufficient, that he is inextricably, or she is inextricably bound up in the awakening of the entire game, the awakening of the entire process. And so commits herself or himself to that above and beyond the mere finding my own personal peace through my own personal enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, and of course, as you alluded to, the Bodhisattva vow, it's that plus the realization of unique self and
Right.
evolutionary unique self, right?
Right.
Because the
That's why I wanted to
Bodhisattva vow is
bracket it
about,
in pre-modern.
right,
Yeah, it's definitely
right,
a
right.
pre-modern notion, but I think it's foreshadowing what we're talking about here at level
Yeah,
6.
right. That even our own liberation, our own level 4 pleasure is not enough. We actually have to participate in the liberation of others. And in this case, at level 6, participation in the liberation through evolution, actually, the integration of the ultimate unqualifiable mystery with the manifest forms that we experience that are always evolving.
Yeah. I
So
can hear
that's,
as we
yeah.
explore levels 4 and 5, David, I can hear the cultural backlash. Can you hear it? You know, there's a cultural
Mm,
backlash. I remember when Mark published his Unique Self book a dozen years ago. There was a whole lot of folks that said this is dangerous. It's the exaltation of the separate self ego and the deification of the separate self ego, which was a misunderstanding of the unique self teaching. I can also hear it in this. I mean, Mark likes to cite the Jimi Hendrix lyric about something about the power of love overthrowing the love of power, but which is understandable. And I can hear that pushback now. Power is dangerous. Well, yeah, power is dangerous if it's expressed through the separate self delusion of the wounded ego. But the clarified unique self expression of power is not only not dangerous, it's essential. It's essential. Think of the power that was required, the unique self power that was required to flow through Martin Luther King to assemble a couple 100,000 people on the Washington Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. That's raw power, but it's a total emergence. Whether he was aware of it or not, I suspect he was at some level. Without the articulation of this Dharma, he still had an awareness. This is mine to do, and I may lose my life. I'm likely, in fact, his realization, what he's likely to lose his life in doing this. To your point about giving up, what is the price of it? I'm likely to lose my life doing this, but this higher cause is worth it.
yeah,
And that's an
exactly.
expression of vast power. That
Yeah,
is, sure, he had his ego-based shadow. You know, I'm not going to claim he was he was free of his woundings and his separate self notions and his own ego gratification. But it's quite clear to me, at least, as someone who kind of lived through that um, uh, and watched that arise in my developmental years, that this is an expression of divine love expressing itself through a unique self. There's not a person I can think of in world history that could have generated that particular response to the American crisis and the American wounding of slavery and its aftermath.
Yeah. And Martin Luther King claimed his power. He recognized to some degree that he he actually had to wield it for this sort of cultural transformation. And so similarly, we all have to face power, as scary as it sounds, but face power and continue to clarify as we do with our unique self. Like, is this power for my self gratification, or is it power in service to evolution? And
Yeah,
if we're able to, actually hold this evolutionary integrity, meaning, thinking about what is evolution asking of me, and what does evolution need from me, and thinking as far down in the future as I can and far in the past as I can, and actually participating in this trajectory of the unfolding evolution of love, that actually is the practice,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And we must practice. I'm struck by the ongoing need for engagement of all of these skills at all six of these levels. And one might ask, well, why would you need, like, once you've had these realizations, why would you need to do anything other than just operate in the world at this powerful level? Well, because the traps of our dharmic history, our karmic history, actually, our karmic history, um, that are still hanging out in our energetic being, in our bodies that we have yet to access, are still pulling at us. But also, those tendrils of our own personal history are latched onto by a whole environment that is also trapped in these messages of separate self. You cannot engage culture at all, or society at all, or other people at all, without receiving these messages of you are a separate self, and here's what power looks like, um, and all of which would, if we were not in a constant process of clarification, drag us back into our old patterns. Which is why I sit on meditation every morning for an hour, and in short intervals throughout the rest of the day, so that I'm not caught off guard, and so that I
Hmm.
can get ever closer to being in a steady state of awareness that I am, in fact, that awakened, clarified, unique self with a unique obligation, unique gifts, unique talents, uh, to respond to the universe's or reality's need for my service. Because the
Yeah.
forces aligned against that are massive and they're constant. So this is not a one and done kind of realization that we're talking about at any of these levels.
Which is an indicator that it is genuine, participating in enlightenment, like genuine enlightenment, because there is no fixed state of, oh, I'm done and that's it. Right? The reality, if you look at the classical teaching of everything is impermanence, everything is always dynamic. So of course, even our realization, the ego is going to come and try to hijack it, and so we have to be constantly surrendering to this larger process and participating in this evolutionary unfolding, and be vigilant and always observing, because there are
Right.
counterfeits, right? So the counterfeits for this, as you already hinted at before, is either our ego can claim that it's doing something for evolution, but it's actually for itself, right? Hijacking. Or there's a way in which we can claim participation in evolution and deny the uniqueness of individuals and the
Right.
uniqueness and the dignity of individuals. So we might, like, I mean, the classic one is the Marxist, um, theory and Marxist revolution
Right.
of, like, oh, there's this time, there's this historical moment, we have to change everything and force a change for the sake of this evolutionary moment. Meanwhile, thousands of people die. It's one of the most dramatically
Right.
terrifying experiences in human history of what's
Right.
happened because of it.
Marxism is
Right.
a classic but not only example of of an evolutionary process, because it's quite clearly an evolutionary political theory, without the moderating influence of the realization of non-separation, of gnosis, and without the realization of unique self. So
Yeah,
if you just jump
exactly.
straight in an evolutionary process from separate self to a cause, even all the way up through the first three levels, even the realization of a cause greater than myself. A lot of Marxists have died on the altar of that cause. So even with that realization, if you don't go through gnosis and then the creative expression through unique self, you get tyranny,
Yeah,
which is the bypassing that Marxism does. This is not an endorsement of any alternative political system. I mean, they all have their failings, and they all have their blind spots. But I resonate with your raising Marxism because it is, in fact, an evolutionary political theory. Evolution by itself doesn't get us there. It doesn't take us home.
yeah. Yeah, and one of the practices I use to help me stay in this evolutionary integrity inquiry is learning about the meta crisis that we're facing as a civilization, actually
Right.
listening to the people that are studying the possible end of humanity as we know it, and actually letting it impact me, letting it break my heart, letting it force me to clarify it in my sense making,
Right.
and die to my smallness, like as if, oh, I can just stay in my small comfort zone and everyone else is going to be fine. Even I'm going to be fine in my small comfort zone with my, my, you know, uh, my Bay Area celebrations and heartfelt dinners and beautiful dance parties and all that. It's like, meanwhile, there's something that's needed from me, and I mean, I'm in a discernment process as we speak about
Right.
making dramatic changes to my life because there is something I'm feeling called toward,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Meanwhile, while I'm in ecstatic dance in Durham on a Sunday midday, meanwhile, 25,000 children will die that day from starvation. Meanwhile, deforestation in the Amazon continues at breathtaking paces. Meanwhile, polar ice caps are melting and threatening the homes of literally billions of humans in the very near future, nearer than we could have predicted 20 years ago. And so to be able to both participate in my own pleasures of evolution and never lose sight that there is no distant suffering. There's no suffering in a distant land. That this is that the cries of the weeping mothers are the cries of my mother. The cries of the father holding his broken child, or evacuating his family from a flooded area in a lowland or a South Pacific island because of rising sea levels. That's my home that's getting flooded, which brings an urgency, really an urgency to the whole project of awakening. I mean, this is not something that I can sit on our hands for. I mean, I might feel a sense of urgency, like, oh my God, I've got to shed this separate self story in order to get out of the mess the lack of pleasure that it brings to me. But if I take on the full implication of everything we've outlined in these six levels, then the realization is that there's also a level of urgency for the sake of the species, and not just our species. I mean, how many species were lost today? Uncounted species died today. We don't even know who they are or what they are. And
Yeah.
so the urgency is built in to our current predicament. It's probably already always been there, and just we are so part of this awakening that we're describing is also awakening to the urgency that this unique self obligation imposes on us.
Which is a reminder that, like many of your listeners might be thinking like, oh my God, this is too much. I don't want to face this. I can't do anything about it. So what's mine? Like I can't deal with this. Well, from the perspective of the separate self, this is too much. It is impossible. And to try to think that we have to heal the whole thing is recipe for depression and anxiety and just countless suffering, more
Right.
additional suffering, right? But when we're able to wake up to the realization that we don't have to heal the whole thing ourselves, that we just heal what's ours to heal. We
Right.
just respond based on a deep realization of our unique gifts. And there's a practice in unique self-emergence that we have everyone do is once we have a process for getting people to beneath the separate self contractions, right, and disentangle that and the false self, right, and get into the deep essence of who we are, into true self, and from that place asking reality, what is needed from me right now?
Mm-hmm.
And from
And
that
it's not
place,
necessarily to organize 200,000 people on the Washington Mall. That was his to do.
right.
That's not mine to do. And you're absolutely right in pointing out that we can, the separate self can feel a sense of inadequacy. Well, I can't do that. I can't save humanity. No one of us can. So the question that a friend of mine asks, Michelle James asks, what's mine to do? No more, no less. What's mine to do? And that comes out of a unique self-realization. Um, and so how do we do that? How does the unique self do that? The unique self looks around to what are my spheres of influence and intimacy? Where can I make a difference given where I'm situated right now? And I may not be able to write the next best-selling book that will change culture's conversation about this, but I can sit across from a client or in a room in a retreat that I'm leading or online in a meditation course that I'm teaching, and these are the people in front of me. These are the unique souls that I'm interacting with right now. And I can bring all of this to that moment, and that's enough. And all of this to the next moment. Just like you and I have brought all of this to this conversation. And then we'll post this and then let go of it. The results of our actions are not our own, says the Bhagavad Gita. So all we can do is all we must do, but we must do it out of our unique self-obligation.
Well, and I love this because the promise of the pleasure map is that it doesn't feel bad to do these things. It's not like we're forcing ourselves to be obligated in some external sense and, oh, we just have to kind of, no, actually, there's the promise of pleasure. When we actually do it, there's the promise that there's a deep pleasure. It may be uncomfortable, it may require a lot of effort and hard work and all that, but there's a pleasure in it. And man, is that just, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps reminding us of that, right? It's like, it's, this is the pleasure. The compass of pleasure is the compass of our unique self and evolution, having a unique experience as you and me.
And I think one way I'd like to close, at least at my end, is there is, for many of us, an allergy to the word obligation. Because it does sound just like you say. It sounds like, oh, I'm obliged to clean the gutters. Or the old donut commercial. Some guy gets up at 3 a.m. It's time to make the donuts. Time to make the donuts. Out of this burdensome sense of obligation. And I think what we're articulating here is a different kind of obligation. It's really a magnificent obligation that draws me into that whom I've always wanted to be. I mean, if I fully respond to this clarified, unique self evolutionary call, this obligation, then I'm actually being called to become who I've always wanted to be, even when I couldn't articulate what that was. And oh my God, is there pleasure in that? Any final words for us, David?
Well, I just, my wish for everyone listening and watching is to, and I think I even said this last time, is to trust their allurements. Trust where you feel lured, because the universe doesn't require you to go through every stage and every level and everything perfectly before it's telling you something. We're all always receiving messages on what is ours to do and what's the next step. And so my invitation, my encouragement is take the next step towards where you feel called, where you feel allured, and the next step will unfold, and the next step and next step. And sometimes it might be uncomfortable, but when you get through it, you'll experience ecstatic pleasure. And that's my blessing and my desire for everyone here.
And I think I'd like to close with the opening portion of Mary Oliver's Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to crawl through the desert on your hands and knees, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. And she goes on to flesh that out. But that is the call of unique self. David,
May it
thank
be
you. This
so.
has been an utter delight. Utter delight. I so look forward to our next conversation. Who knows what we'll explore next?
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. It's great to be with you.
Yeah.